We know that our backyards, our gardens, our natural spaces can be wonderful habitat for birds and bees, and oftentimes gardeners in particular are really keen to bring these animals directly to our yards. But we don't often think of our yard, our balcony, even the acres we might possess as a living ecosystem. Well, on today's show, that's what we're thinking through and talking with an expert with a new book out all about the way that we can understand wildlife as part of an ecosystem and our own role in helping to design and add to that, even when we're dealing with very small amounts of land, and even when we're thinking about the kind of minute levels of the ways we can change soil or rock placement just to make what we have a little more welcoming to other species all around us. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and Associate Director of EcoStudio and Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Sean McCasham is a landscape ecologist and botanist whose new book, Natural Habitats and Wildlife Gardening, is out now. Sean, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
So just to start off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know you wear many hats. You've thought about ecology and habitats from a range of perspectives. You think about native plants a lot. So I think you come at this work from kind of a range of perspectives, all within a kind of scientific focus, thinking about wildlife and natural ecosystems. But from a very different perspective on, everything from backyard gardens to kind of larger projects. Maybe walk us through your work a little bit first.
Sure. So I've been working in overall like ecology for like 20 years. I started off doing just restoration work focused on like invasive species and habitat degradation, and then moved into pollinator and small mammal conservation out in Nevada. Went on and earned a PhD in landscape ecology, looking at how our agricultural systems are affecting our native bees, and then ended up getting a job working as a wildlife or a preserve manager
Mm,
for Westchester Land Trust outside of New York City. And in all of these projects, I've been able to look at different aspects of ecology. Where do we look for animals? Where do we see them? What time of year are they going to be occupying different spaces? And then how do we support them, of course, and what's harming them, but also how do we promote them? And there's quite a lot of habitat destruction throughout the globe. And the more that I was working in these systems, the more that I was realizing how much we've interrupted a lot of the
mm.
natural processes that created these really healthy and picturesque landscapes that so many of us like to visit when we go to national parks and everything. And then started to realize that we had a really heavy bias to this already broken system.
Mm.
And in a lot of the work that I was doing with specific species or specific guilds, I was able to start to put together these ideas of how to better recreate resources to support life cycles. And in doing that, one of the best ways to do it, I think, is to get everyday landowners to look at their yard and say, how can I make this pretty? But how can I make it support our butterflies, our bees, our birds, and everything else?
That's terrific. And I think that really gives a good kind of nutshell of what I think a lot of people take away from this book, which is really about, with my whatever little patch of land that I have, what can I be doing to really try to be thinking about my neighbors, the bees and butterflies and raccoons and bears and all manner of species you bring in.
Yeah. Yes, and many times in the book, I say it would be irresponsible to say that we should reintroduce bison to our backyards or bears or wolves, but the animals that do persist inside of our landscapes, they still depend on so many of those resources that were created.
Mm,
And one of the things I find really interesting is when I give talks about like let's look at how bison affect the landscape. The immediate knee-jerk reaction by people who don't want to have this conversation are like, "Well, bison just eat grass." Like, what are you talking about? It's like, right. but they're these big animals that create wetlands because they like to take dust baths, and those dust baths turn into wallows. And there's this system that is supposed to be turning over in that landscape, and we've stopped it. We've removed those bison. We've also stopped the succession. But the toads that are still in our backyards, they still want that fresh, clean wetland that
Mm,
forms every few years that isn't filled with parasites and fungus and everything that's going to kill them off. So we can easily recreate those spaces by either recreating a pond, making sure our ponds are clean, um, compacting some soil for like they do in their paths that create nesting sites for bees. They're very simple to grasp and comprehend and put together once we start to look through that filter.
mm. So I think that's really interesting because and something that you say early in the book that I really gravitated towards was I don't want to say you call out, but maybe you point out that, a lot of folks, especially those who I think are, conservation minded or ecologically minded in some way, often kind of jump to, well, I just need to put a lot of native plants in my yard. And it's certainly you're not critiquing the use of wanting to put native plants in, but you go a step beyond that and really in this book, I think, do a nice job of trying to shift our frame of mind from just, oh, it's just some plants or just, some things that I recognize as beneficial on their own to much more habitat thinking, much more thinking about really like ecosystems. And so I want to just hear from you a little bit why this shift in our thinking. Why is it important rather than just thinking about, here's some good plants or here's a good thing that I'm throwing out here? Why is it actually really important for us to think through how am I creating a habitat, an ecosystem, which I think will also let us talk about some of the ways that you actually show how we can kind of model exactly as you're saying those broader practices that might happen that of course we aren't actually going to have bison in our backyards, but yeah, we can, try to think through some of those steps we can do to imitate some of these patterns. So yeah, a little on habitat and ecosystems.
Yeah, so native plants are incredibly important. And like you said, I'm not trying to detract from that conversation, but simply add to it. So native plants are going to feed a lot of organisms, but they don't necessarily provide the shelter for those
Mm,
animals. And when we're looking at all these articles that are published for promoting pollinators, there's always a plant list, right?
yep.
But there's very, very few times where there talks about where do these animals go in shelter? Where are they spending the winter is a good
Mm,
example. So let's take monarchs, for example, where they're migratory. They're going to be in our yards for a little bit of time. But if you only plant milkweed, they need a safe space to get off of that milkweed between every single caterpillar instar because they shed their skin. That's an exoskeleton. They don't have bones. So that has to come off so they can continue to grow. And they don't want to do that on the plant because they're susceptible to flies and wasps
mm,
that will parasitize them. So they need to go into a safe area where they can get away from the sun, get away from those parasitoids, shed their skin. And then when they pupate, same idea. If they stay on the plant and there's a lot of other monarch caterpillars or any of the other species that eat milkweed, eating that tissue and exposing them to sunlight, they're going to get cooked and they're going to die. And we don't
mm,
want that to happen. So we have to provide some sort of shelter for those organisms. And quite often when I'm talking with different gardeners that are trying to build butterfly gardens or have successfully done so in the last few years, they all have these great stories of like, oh, I found something pupating like on the stool I sit on. And it's like, right, because that's a safe shelter. It's a solid material that they recognize as safety, where the plant itself is not as safe, but it is really important for them to eat, right?
mm. No, that's terrific. Okay, so I want to talk more about habitat, but I want to ask you a question that you address really well in the book, and so I'm sure you'll have an answer to it now. But I think something that, for a lot of folks, when they do hear, habitat or ecosystem, I think it's easy to kind of go, I don't have 100 acres. I don't even have 20 acres. I can't go out and put a giant retention pond on my land. And I think one of the things you do nicely throughout the book is try to shift the conversation to what are you working with and how can you think about this kind of regardless of scale. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because for folks who are jumping to, whoa, wildlife habitats way more than I'm capable of doing in my, quarter-acre backyard or townhome garden or whatever it is. How are you thinking about the ways we can still intervene in some of these other spaces that not everything needs to be acreage?
So with whatever size of yard that we're working with, we're going to be able to support some level of wildlife, be it you can grow a 2 gallon, pot of plants that's going to somewhat support a pollinator or
Mm,
potentially a butterfly or something that could feed on that species. Um, the way to really kind of scale the process is to look at what you can support and then what do those species depend on in the natural ecosystem, and then how can we recreate it? How can we be the bison that comes in and breaks plants down to smashes them towards the soil so that sunlight can get down there and seeds can sprout, is the same thing that we're doing when we're putting in new soil and putting seeds in the ground. Like we are being the bison in that situation. So if you have a small, 10 foot by 2 foot area, you're going to be able to support a few things that will be able to at least get into the ground versus like a
mm.
balcony where you'd have pots. The pots are going to freeze from multiple directions. So anyone who's working in that small space is going to support less species diversity, but they can still support many things that would still overwinter or at least visit in the summer. All the migratory birds and butterflies that come through our area, monarchs are migratory, American ladies are migratory, red admirals are migratory, Gulf fritillaries are migratory. There's all of these insects that migrate. We don't think about it, but we can
Mm.
provide food sources for them with the native plants, but we can also provide some type of shelter for their caterpillars if they've got a short life cycle in the area, and continue to build those spaces and those resources. And then, of course, scale it up. If you do have a quarter acre or even 5 acres, you can build these massive, beautiful landscapes, but you can also have an unbelievably gorgeous garden bed, in a very small yard in the front of your house or in the back of your house.
Well, I want to think about that a little bit because I do think a garden bed is a great place to start with just, and throughout the book, you are attentive to a number of these different things. You mentioned shelter. And in thinking about a garden bed, I think for most of us, if we're thinking about a garden, we're probably thinking about, I want pretty flowers. I want it to look nice, right? And so that's the first place we go. And probably maybe secondarily, we start to think about, well, I could support some pollinators and I could plant some plants that would do well. What are other things we could be doing in that garden bed to add on? You've mentioned shelter. Are there other practices that we might consider that would just help us to bring in some different wildlife or create either food sources or safety or any of the other things that, just make that ecosystem a little better for things all up and down the food chain?
So diversifying soil is the next space that I like to
Mm,
direct people to. So when we're growing plants and you go to any garden center, they're going to talk a lot about healthy soils and how to create the perfect soils for plants. We have to think about our wildlife the same way. A lot of our amphibians, for example, need organic rich materials with loose soils that they can easily burrow into because they don't have really strong claws. If you're trying to support sphinx moths or some of the more gorgeous large moths or even the ugly ones because you want to feed the birds. A lot of those organisms need to be able to push their little soft caterpillar bodies into the soil. So we
mm,
need to diversify our soils just a little bit. Adding garden beds, rocky borders or log borders, however you want to make that border, you can turn that space into a shelter as well as utilize it in a way that's going to attract some type of the wildlife. For areas that have a lot of lizards, having a really nice rock next to your vegetation, the lizards will go out and sun on that and then also dart into the plants for shelter, be able to crawl somewhere at night to spend the night in a safe space and then come back out the next day. These are all things that are really easy to incorporate into gorgeous garden beds that at first we probably don't think about. Like, you're right, you want pretty flowers, but the more people deal with flowers, all of a sudden they're like, oh wait, I want a pot, or I want a statue, or I
mhm,
want a rock. Those are all things that work as shelter and can
mm,
be intentionally set up to support wildlife or installed in a way that really doesn't help wildlife. So
mm,
it's really kind of breaking down that, like, oh, if I do something just a little bit different, like make sure there's a crawl space underneath this rock that I've put in my garden
mm.
so that an animal can get under it, versus making sure there's a perfectly sandy connection and it's stable, and the Rock of Gibraltar could fall on it and it's not going to move. You're also not going to have wildlife in there.
I mean, that's really interesting because I think it's one of the things that you point out in multiple places is different ways of creating shelter. You've mentioned ponds, you've mentioned rocks. I mean, sometimes it's very deliberate shelter that we're maybe more familiar with, like a bat house or a bird house. At one point, you actually point out a raccoon house, which that was new
Mhm.
to me. Do you want to talk about raccoon houses at all?
Sure. So again, going on the size of your property and the overall neighborhood that you live in. The neighborhood that I live in right now, it's mostly a suburban track home kind of area. Lots are in between 4 and 8,000 square feet. So not huge yards, but
Hmm.
they're decent. Possums have shown up. So we've just
Mm-hmm.
made sure to create some spaces where the possums are not being chased by our dog. Our dog is really calm, which is nice, but they can get away from our neighbors' dogs. And the neighbors, we don't tell them that we're supporting these possums, we're letting them have a place to live. But the possums are an important aspect to our overall ecosystem that's here.
Yeah.
So you can
Great for
create these.
eating nasty things we don't want in the yard.
Exactly, yeah. Um, and they're just and they're important, right? They belong in the system. They do functions that we're not necessarily paying attention to. So, with any of the shelters that you're creating inside of restoration, we do quite regularly create tortoise shelters
Mm,
and burrowing owl shelters, and that's really where the raccoon house came from, and even the fox shelter is. You just need to create a space underground that is mimicking one of the larger burrowing animals like
mm.
black-tailed prairie dogs. Groundhogs are important ones, things that we chase out of our yards that we typically don't want in our neighborhoods, but they still created a space that is useful for a number of other animals. So you can create these raccoon shelters simply by burying a dog kennel under the ground or under a pile of mulch. Instead, what's happening if we don't intentionally do that is these animals will find washouts underneath our foundation, or they'll find a shed that's not used that often. And they're really relegated to these less than ideal situations and resources that are comfortable enough. But it's like saying, yeah, that really shanty hotel at the end of the road that like has a couple working lights is the same as the Hilton, right? These are very different levels of resources for us, and we can similarly, you know, push that onto these wildlife and try and create really healthy resources that they want to utilize. And then you can also direct their movements that way and keep them out of harm's way.
I think that's also something that you mentioned at one point is, and this is certainly a complaint I've heard many times, is folks saying, well, if you have that, leaf pile in the back, you might get snakes, you might attract, and it's one of those things of like, yes, you might.
Yes.
Simultaneously, if you don't have it there, it that snake's gonna wanna be somewhere else, as you were saying with the raccoon. It's suddenly under the house in a way that's probably not ideal for anybody, and so there's a measure of actually trying to control where these animals might be, that I think is really interesting. I'm curious to hear a little bit. You mentioned like that possum, trail or, kind of safe space, and it's how does one create a safe area for the possum to avoid dogs? I mean, those are interesting things around the way we think about laying out space that I don't think is normally the kind of front of mind for how we're imagining backyard landscapes.
Right. So, one of the ways to like keep animals safe is to make sure that they can get out of danger
Mm,
and into an area where they're not going to feel threatened.
mm,
So, in our backyard, like our dog, we let her out, to do her business, wander, lay in the sun, whatever she wants to, and come back in at her own leisure. But if we have a possum out there, when the possums are out there, they simply just need to be able to get into a protected space. So one of the
mm.
areas I have just branches, stacked up like a fence that the possums can easily crawl through, but our dog can't. She's 100 pounds. She's a little bit larger. She's a lot easier to keep out of these spaces. If we had a Chihuahua, it would be a little bit different, right? But if we had a Chihuahua, then I would make sure that the space was elevated because possums will typically take a hollow log up inside
Mm.
of a tree. So you can do that as well.
So another kind of habitat moment that I thought was really interesting that I'd love to hear you talk about a little bit is the way that we can mimic some kind of patterns of nature in our own spaces. I think for a lot of folks, probably the one that's most common or the one they thought the most about is fire, especially around Texas. I think we have a pretty good understanding that fire is a natural part of ecosystem revitalization. We've seen controlled burns probably happen. I think folks certainly we've talked about controlled burns on the program before. And while I will admit I do know a few conservationists in Houston who, on the down low, have admitted to me doing controlled burns in their backyard when it probably was I don't know if it was actually illegal, but I know their wives definitely didn't want them doing that. There are ways, and I really like that you point out, with a number of different kind of natural patterns, we can mimic some of those effects. So for the homeowner like me who does not have a giant backyard, did not design my gardens to burn and have things in them where I'm not going to burn any of my backyard spaces. What are things that I could or should be doing to mimic some of those natural processes like those natural fires?
Yeah, so fire is a really good example of things that we can do that don't include fire, but we can mimic what it does. So fire goes and removes all of that dead, dry vegetation from the aerial space, and it allows sunlight to reach the soil. It prevents thatch layers from building up,
Mm,
and in areas where we have suppressed fire and have allowed mowing to like, replace the fire itself, we're finding that thatch is actually affecting bumblebee nesting capabilities,
mm.
possibly other ground nesting bee capabilities. And it's also preventing the establishment of annuals. So it's starting to select for cool season invasive grasses. So the
Okay.
easiest thing that we can do to mimic fire is if you mow, you still need to collect that vegetation and move it, into piles so that the sunlight is still getting down, that the dead vegetation is not present in the
Mm.
landscape. Similarly, if you want to replicate what bison do or elk or bears or any of these large animals, even in the if you go, how do I want to say this? So if you go to a national park with a really healthy population of animals,
Mhm.
you'll notice that in the middle of the summer, you don't see a lot of dead vegetation just standing around. And that's
Mm.
because the wind, the snow, and the big animals all crush that vegetation layer and push it towards the ground. That facilitates the nutrient cycles to then break it down. The soil microbes can do their business, and it all breaks down, decays, feeds the nutrient cycle, feeds native plants, and everything, continues in that cycle. Inside of our yards, same idea. We should not be letting large stands of vegetation continue to persist year after year. It does need to be cut down. It does need to be gathered up. It needs to be moved around, still kept on site. But we do need to clean up our yards so that we're mimicking these natural processes. If we don't, what we end up doing is really promote succession, but create a really unnatural system because none of these systems are supposed to be plants gone wild without
Mm.
any of the feedback systems of large animals coming in and eating them and crushing them and wind coming in and all of these things that are supposed to be disturbing that plant community.
So maintenance is good there. I'm curious because you're talking about that crushing down. How does that relate to mulch? Because I mean, it's one of the things that I think folks tend to jump to as a really good practice is mulching the yard, making sure that we're conserving the rainwater and the numerous other benefits that the mulch has. And so is that something, if we aren't able to go in and burn, then
Mhm.
is that something that we should actually be concerned about? Is that something that, there are practices we should be utilizing around mulching?
So regenerative gardening is a really good um, mindset to have when we're doing this. So for Greg's misflower is a good example. Grows abundantly in Houston. It's a really great plant to have. It will create really thick thatches.
Hmm.
And if we don't cut it down, it has problems actually growing back after a couple of years because it can't get its shoots up through that thatch and get to the sunlight. So what I do is I go through with big shears and I cut down the plants once. In February, there's one cut. It's not getting broken down or anything. And then all of those stems are laid into a circle around the plant so that
Mm.
they're much shorter. They're creating structure for things to grow in. They're creating a space for animals like beetles and moths to pupate in, even butterflies. And then that area is functioning as a mulch. It's keeping that soil protected. It's keeping it shaded enough, but it also allows the plant enough, short space that it's protected, but it can still get to the sunlight and start feeding itself and then continue to
Mhm.
grow.
So
But yes,
another
it does
yeah.
function. You can function as mulch. Use leaves as mulch. Use anything in your yard that is a natural material. Utilize it instead of going to the box store and getting brand new mulch. Utilize the stuff that's produced on your property as a mulch.
So something that I wanted to hear about too, because I think a process that we've talked about fire a good bit, but another one, that at least in Houston we do tend to get periodically, but I don't know that we're really getting the benefit of is flooding. That you actually really point out that flooding is a natural process in environments. So can you walk us through a little bit? what that role of flooding is, which I don't think we often think about as a kind of ecosystem engineer, and some of the lessons that we can maybe deploy in our own homes around that excess rainwater.
So flooding is an important landscape process. And inside of our gardens, it's a little bit harder to replicate because typically a long-term flood is going to shift the entire vegetation community.
Mm.
And that would be the same as redoing our yards completely and planting a whole new garden. And a lot of us don't want to do that.
At least not
But
very often.
at least not very often. But if we talk about like wet years versus dry years, where there's a
Mhm.
lot more water in the landscape versus the drier years where it's not, that changes the overall vegetation community. So in drier spaces, like not really Houston, but if you come down here to Corpus Christi and even South Texas, the wet years are really important for the deep-rooted perennials to establish when there's a disturbance. And then once they've established because the rain has been persistent enough, then they can survive the drought years like we're in right now. But the that flooding is going to bring in typically new nutrients. It's going to allow things to break down faster.
Mm.
So inside of our yards, if we're irrigating any of those spaces, it's important to understand that what we're replicating is really that flood year. So we want to make sure that if we're watering spaces, there should be organic material there to really feed some of those nutrient cycles, but also
Mm.
create those microhabitats that organisms are going to utilize, especially our amphibians.
That's great. So something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, just in talking that I wanted to think through a little bit was you mentioned, your own house in relation to your neighbors. And I think this is something that I thought was really thoughtful in the book that I hadn't thought about a lot before, which is thinking about yourself in relation to what's around you, especially I think when we're thinking about kind of suburban properties or, townhome communities, where we have a lot of neighbors, or we have a range of yards. And I'm curious about you mentioned in the book, something very direct around if you have a lot of neighbors, a lot of trees, that's providing a kind of service. So what is different about your property if you don't have trees? Can you just talk us through thinking a little bit strategically and some ways of thinking around what our yard might mean and look like in terms of I'm looking around, I'm seeing a lot of X or a lot of Y around me. How should I respond to that as I'm thinking about what I can do for wildlife, what I can do to build that ecosystem beyond my own fence line?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, looking at our yards on the overall landscape scale is really going to help us understand how animals might be utilizing our yard.
Mm.
So, if you're in a neighborhood where every house has a tree, if it's all like acorn trees or walnut trees or pecan trees, that's going to attract a lot of birds and squirrels, which is great. So, you can then look at the landscape and say, okay, I know I'm going to have these birds, I know I'm going to have these squirrels. Is there anything that those animals are dependent on that isn't present? And typically that's going to be hollow branches, it's going to be squirrel nest boxes, could even be bat boxes. So you can put up nest boxes for your birds, you can put up platforms. A lot of your blue jays, your mockingbirds, they're going to need platforms, not hollow boxes.
Hmm.
You can put up squirrel nest boxes if you want to attract squirrels to certain area instead of, if they don't have the right environment, they might choose your attic, right? So they're relegating themselves to that area, which is not a great space. But if we provide a good one, they'll choose that over the less appropriate space for them.
That
We can also look at if is water absent. Do a lot of
Mhm.
people have bird baths, or does no one have a bird bath? And if a lot of people have bird baths out, then you probably don't need to add that to your yard. Bird baths are also a problem because they can spread a lot of diseases and they do need to be cleaned, and we need to be paying attention to how that might be factoring in. But if, say, no one has any water up or anything like berry producing bushes, it's
Mm.
all lawn and trees, well, then let's plant some berry producing plants that's going to feed birds when they're moving through the landscape and migrating through the country or, in the continent.
That's great. So I want to get to a kind of concrete section, which you have, I mean, as I've mentioned, you think through a lot of different kind of basic ecosystem knowledge for us. You also have some great sections on the book around the kind of insects and animals we might experience in our yard. You walk through a litany of bees and butterflies. You talk through, plants that might help to support them. But you do have some really concrete guidance, and I want to talk through that just a little bit around kind of where to start and identifying both your own space. As we mentioned, some people have 40 acres, some people have a balcony, And so, very different needs here. But I mean, the first step you say folks should start with is just choosing a garden design type. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And as we kind of, if somebody is thinking, I'd really love to do more with the space that I have. I'd love to create a little more habitat. How would you start encouraging them with that garden design type and just thinking through what they're going to do?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing this up because this is a really important aspect when we are talking about habitat. Is there's this misguided idea that habitats have to be messy. They have
Mm,
to be this kind of weed lot or even a cottage garden is the only style that's going to work to create habitat. And in the book, I highlight that pretty much any garden design type, architecture type that you want, we can recreate that with most native plants. If you live in an area that is pretty wet, like Houston, you have so many amazing native plants that will allow you to design lots of different things. So if you've always dreamed of having a Japanese style garden,
mm,
you can say, okay, I want a Japanese style garden. So let's start picking out plants that can be trimmed heavily. So that's going to be our Senecio. Let's talk about some of the evergreens to mimic the pines. You're going to be able to find some of our native pine trees for that. Some of our native junipers will work too. And you can then start to piecemeal these things together and design this landscape in a way that is architecturally and aesthetically pleasing to yourself and to your neighbors, but is also intentionally providing habitat for a number of other organisms. If we are intentionally including the shelter, intentionally including water, intentionally not using pesticides, we're going to create a safer space for organisms to
mm,
thrive inside of our yards. So in my front yard, I'm currently working on creating garden beds that I want people that I can photograph and show people this plan can be yours. Let's put
mm,
in those low growing, showy evening primrose flowers inside of the hell strip. People see it and they're just like, oh, that's gorgeous. In some of the other areas where I want really low growing cover, I'm putting in frog fruit and then growing that next to bunch grasses. And this can all be orderly, it can all be in lines. The animals aren't going to sit here and be like, "Oh, that's a straight line. I can't use that property." Like that's not how it works. And even in nature, when you see a big, tall, like tupelo that's fallen down, it's in a straight line, and that creates a nursery log that the
mm,
animals are still utilizing. So we can utilize straight lines and everything. It doesn't have to be what most people call messy. But
mm.
the most important things that we do, stop using pesticides and keep all the organic material that we produce on our property in our property, reutilize it for mulch, reutilize it for, new garden structures for vines to grow on. We can do all of that instead of ship these animals off when they're in the egg stage or in their pupating stages.
So, right on the heels of that, I mean, the second thing you suggest is just targeting a few wildlife species that you want to identify and bring into the space. And so, how would folks go about that if they are interested in, I really want to bring birds to the yard. I really want to bring butterflies to the yard. Probably the most common, probably the most ones that folks are familiar with. But I'm curious if you have advice as folks are thinking through their garden spaces about ways to just, I mean, beyond reading your book, to really think through what are ways that I can narrow down, oh, this would actually be really healthy and helpful for the ecosystem that I'm in?
Yeah, that's another good question. So I do also want to talk about real fast. The book isn't just a lot of text. I worked with two amazing photographers that did that
Basically,
fantastic job.
every page has photos. I will say you have a
Yeah,
lot of great examples.
it uses those real world examples so people can start to get ideas from these pictures as well as starting to sit down, but we want to think about the species, not necessarily the guild. So if you want to
Mm,
support birds, we need to narrow that down. Do you want to support doves or do you want to support a mockingbird?
mm.
Personally, I like mockingbirds. One mockingbird, 400 calls, right? So you've got a whole choir in the background. uh, but you want to select which species you're going to support and then start asking yourself, and in the book helps describe some of these things: where does it spend the winter, where is it
Mm,
nesting, where is it feeding, where is it sleeping every night, and then providing those resources. Inside of conservation, there used to be this idea, there still is this idea, that if we protect one organism like an elephant, and therefore we're protecting its habitat, and that's called umbrella conservation. Everything that's in that habitat is going to be protected. Well, studies are now showing that that's actually not helping as much as we thought it was because
Mm,
we've tailored the ecosystem too much for that one species. So if we start to think about two or three species, then we really start getting these dynamic systems with more microhabitats and more niches that organisms can then fill in. And it helps just build a much more robust area.
mm,
So with picking one or two species, that's great. If you can pick three or four, even better. If you want to support birds, you're going to want to support, unless you're supporting doves, all the other birds are going to feed their young caterpillars. So we're going to want to support some sort of insect, preferably in the Lepidopteran group. Doug Tallamy has some great advice about plant an oak tree. Oak trees, or the genus of oaks, is in most of the habitats across North America. They support about 400 different species of Lepidoptera across the
mm.
nation. So if we plant an oak, don't use pesticides, we're going to get the moths and butterflies that utilize that species, and then the birds can come in and hunt for caterpillars there. One thing that Dr. Tallamy does miss is that in the grassland areas, grasshoppers are really important. So if we can
Mm,
grow things that are going to support grasshoppers or a lot of these organisms that we consider pests, that's going to feed birds as well.
great. The last thing I wanted to just touch on was you have something that we've talked about a little bit on the show before. We've had some other garden designers on. Pam Pennick is a great episode. If folks haven't listened to that, I'd suggest you go back in the archive. But
Mhm.
you highlight something that I haven't heard folks refer to in this way, which is the 70-30 ratio, which goes to that point around, that kind of messiness we often kind of fear with a lot of when we think of a kind of native plant landscapes. And this idea of 70% natives to 30% non-native, really thinking about the way at one point you refer to it as engaging neighbors with design. And so I'm curious if you want to talk just a little bit about the way that we can bring people to our gardens, the way that we can think through this, and that not everything has to just be one or the other. There's actually some give and play here.
Yes. So the 70-30 rule kind of builds off of Dr. Tallamy's work, finding that about 70% native plants still has the same threshold of bird diversity as 100% native plant.
Mm,
And if we think about our habitats and understand that habitats aren't 100% native plants, there's downed wood, there's open bodies of water, there's rock cliffs. These are all different things that are going to play into it. And inside of our landscape, we also have to understand that there's no way to get 100% native plant cover because we have driveways, we have roofs, and we're not covering these things as well. So give yourself grace, is the way that I look at this. And if you can't have 100% native plant design, that's okay. One of the issues with just overall environment and habitat is our food consumption.
mm,
The average piece of produce that is in our grocery store has traveled 1,500 miles before it has reached that grocery store from where it was grown. Now, some of this is because there's some ridiculous pieces of fruit that go from South America to China to us for packaging, but if we can just interrupt that system and grow a little bit of our own food, most of the plants we want to grow for food aren't native. There are a lot
mm,
of natives that we can eat, but I want to grow tomatoes. It's not technically a native plant to North America, and we've bred it to not be. Corn is a good example. Corn is native to North America. Different varieties have been selected for by indigenous agriculture for a long time, but we've bred it even further, and it's no longer really a native plant. But it's a really good thing for us to eat. It's a good thing that supports some of our wildlife. So give grace when it comes to that. The other aspect is there's a lot of plants that people recognize as a garden, out in Houston, out in Corpus Christi, sweet potato vine is a really good example. Sweet potato
mm,
vines
mhm,
aren't native, but they cover the ground. They work as a living mulch. They're fantastic. If you put that close to where people are viewing your landscape, it helps them understand that what has been done in that yard is intentional and not simply a yard that was left or
mm,
kind of designed and then, efforts have shifted away from it. So if we can create ways that people see our yards and start to appreciate that the habitats that we're creating are in fact attractive and gorgeous, we should be doing that. When I moved into this house, we moved here 2 years ago. One of the first things I planted was Greg's mist flower.
yep.
The All five of the neighbors around me, the ones houses across the street from me and the two directly next to me, they all now have Greg's mistflower. And only one of them asked about native plants. The other four were like, that's a really pretty flower. There's so many butterflies on it. And I'm like, oh, would you like a propagation of it? They propagate really easy. And I didn't need to go into that it's native plants. I didn't need to go into that it's supporting all these different animals. All I had to do is like, it's pretty. Do you want it in your yard? And they said yes. So that's a way to engage your neighbors. Like we don't have to sell them on the idea and the importance of native habitats. We simply just sometimes need to tell people like, hey, you can have a pretty plant in your yard too.
Well, Dr. Sean McCossum, it has been a delight getting to chat with you. The book is Natural Habitats and Wildlife Gardening, Inviting Nature into Your Backyard. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Now we'll go to our researcher, Sophia, who has another in her series of Urban Explorer pieces for you.
Hey everyone, it's Sophia, and welcome back to Urban Explorer, where we find wild places in city spaces. Today, we're visiting Helens Park in Southwest Houston, which is open to the public and privately owned by the Bracewood Place HOA. The park is known for its perfectly maintained flora, intricate mosaic installations, and the variety of animals that frequent the area. Fondly referred to by some as a Southwest Houston gem, this pocket park definitely lives up to its title. So let's check it out. I got the chance to go to Helens Park with fellow nature enjoyer Josh Posada. As we walked in off the street, we immediately felt transported from the usual hustle and bustle of Houston. The peaceful sound of the brook flowing through the park welcomed us, as dragonflies lazily hovered over the lush greenery and the occasional turtle or shorebird enjoyed the natural amenities. Beyond the natural beauty of Helens Park, though, we very much enjoyed the mosaic art pieces around the whole perimeter, and especially the large mosaic fountain in the middle of the park. All that being said, Helens Park certainly has my stamp of approval, so let's hear from Josh now. What was your favorite part of our visit to Helens Park?
I would have to say my favorite part of the park was when we were walking a little bit of ways, and then there was some like a middle area with like a cool mosaic, some cool like models that had water going down the stream like on each side, and it kind of like was the centerpiece of the walk, but then also went down to the different kind of man-made streams, and just the sound of the rocks just was really tranquil and it was really nice.
And what were you most surprised about?
I think the biggest surprise for me was the amount of like actual life there. As we were walking at first, it was just, it looked a lot like kind of man-made. There was a lot of like topiary things, some really nice selections of like trees, but there wasn't anything like living in terms of like animals. But then as we started kind of slowing down and taking the walk slower, there was like a really cool looking like white sort of bird, like a kind of like a mini stork. I'm not really familiar with birds, but it was really cool. And then there was some dragonflies, some really cool like turquoise looking dragonflies that were really nice. And then when we kind of stopped and actually sat down on the nice benches that were provided by the park, we saw some turtles, which was really cool to see, like a little mini turtle that was that popped its head out and then kind of ran away, and that was really nice.
Would you consider coming back to visit Helens Park or recommending it to others?
I definitely would recommend it. I think that just in Houston with like the hustle and bustle of like the concrete jungle and everyone kind of being more of a metropolitan area, it was just kind of a nice oasis to get back whenever you're kind of just in the midst of busyness. It's just a really nice place to kind of walk around and feel like, even if you kind of close your perspective and really just focus on the area of there that kind of had the cool nature, trees, and like wildlife, that made its way from the urban and suburban areas. It's really cool. I would definitely recommend it to anyone who lives in the city or anyone looking for kind of a oasis away from the main man-made stuff.
As Josh mentioned, if you're in the area and looking to reconnect with nature, Helens Park just might be the perfect place for you. Come stroll on the walkable pathways or sit on one of the many benches to enjoy the beautiful flowers and palm trees. Bring your binoculars in case you spot any hawks or finches, or as we did, shorebirds, lounging in the lush greenery. And, as always, make sure to respect the land and leave it exactly as you found it. Thanks for tuning into Urban Explorer, and make sure to come back soon to hear more about unique parks in the greater Houston area.
Finally, here's another in Sophia's Critter Corner series, which seems particularly appropriate since we've been talking about how to attract wildlife to our yards.
Hi everyone, it's Sophia, and welcome back to Critter Corner, where we dive into Houston's fascinating wildlife. In each episode, we feature experts and enthusiasts who share their favorite local flora and fauna, the role in our ecosystem, and ways that we can all support our community's biodiversity. In this episode, we're joined by Carla Clay, the founding director of Artist Boat with over 30 years of experience in arts and environmental education, and who led the way to conserve over 1,000 acres on Galveston Island. Welcome to the show, Carla.
Hi, thank you, Sophie.
Of course. So to start off, can you tell me a bit about yourself and the work that you do?
I'm Carla Clay. I'm the executive director of the Artist Boat. At Artist Boat, we integrate art and science through 6 different programs to teach people about marine environments and coastal margins, from eco art kayak adventures to in-school residency programs. Everyone produces some kind of artwork to translate knowledge about the environment. They're as simple as little watercolors to like permanent murals or mosaics, or trash barrels on the beach that are painted with trash messages, things like that. My work is mostly as the executive director, fundraising, grant writing, and making sure we can pay all our bills, but also that we have the staff to deliver our programs.
Well, thank you for sharing about some of the fascinating work that you do, and I'm super excited to dive in with you today. So, with that, can you tell us what species you're talking about today and why it's special to you?
My favorite animal that's not human that I've made friends with is a bottlenose dolphin. So I grew up in the Florida Keys. My dad was a shark biologist, and we had shark pens in the Gulf of Mexico, and he shipped sharks all around the world and kept them alive in captivity. And next door to us was Flipper Sea School, which is now the Dolphin Research Center. And so I've been friends with dolphins since I can remember anything. And they're very intelligent. They all have different personalities and likes and dislikes. And one dolphin, who is the star in the movie The Big Blue, Nachua, I was very close to my whole childhood. And when I was older, I went back and did a summer internship at the Dolphin Research Center, and Nachua always knew who I was, and everybody say, "Oh, Nachua has a great affinity towards you," which I already knew. But I think we learn a lot from other mammals and friendships with other species, because there are languages way older than words, and those languages are intuitive to all animals. But if you wanted to know about bottlenose dolphins, I could also tell you more about them as a being, like how they work and their senses and all of that.
Yeah, I would love to hear about that. And that sounds like a really special experience that you got to share. So I'm wondering, are bottlenose dolphins at all native to Galveston Bay or other close areas of the Gulf of Mexico?
Oh, yeah. So they're a very coastal species. Most of our bays on the Gulf of Mexico have a resident population of bottlenose dolphins. We also have populations of bottlenose dolphins in the Gulf of Mexico. But for example, in Galveston Bay, I think over 3,000 individuals have been identified here after the oil spill in Barataria-Terrebonne estuary. There have been no successful live dolphin births because of all the damage done to the population from the oil spill. And people think, why don't they leave? It's polluted. But they grew up there. That's their home. And they know that the bottlenose dolphins of different bays are very faithful to those bays. So like Tampa Bay has a population. We have a population here. Down in Corpus, Aransas Pass has a population. And they live in matriarchal family groups. And the boys disperse when they get older and have to find a new family to hang out with.
What role does the bottlenose dolphin play in Galveston Bay's ecosystem, as well as the many other areas that they can be found?
Well, the bottlenose dolphin is a top predator, so they can eat what they want. They also need a lot of food, so they probably might be perceived by fishermen to compete for food. But they're definitely a top predator, eating, fish in quite an abundant amount. Of course, they're also very good for tourism, because, you can sustain a dolphin watch vessel, and people will pay to go see the dolphins in the ship channel or wherever. Well, they see them in the ship channel. Here is the best place to see them.
Yeah, and you've already shared a lot of interesting facts about this species, but what is one extra surprising fact about the bottlenose dolphin that you especially find interesting and that people might not know?
Oh, well, I think they're fascinating. One, they're conscious breathers. All marine mammals have to decide when to take a breath. So I always tell people, imagine if every time you just needed to breathe, you had to decide to breathe. That's a lot of attention to pay attention to yourself to breathe. So they have to be very smart. Also, with their sonar, they can send, scientists believe that they sonar something, they send out sound, they get an image back. Now, it won't be the image like we see in our eyes. And that image, they suspect that they can send it to another bottlenose dolphin. So it would be like I went to the restaurant and was like, hey, Sophie, look at my lasagna. And I sent you mentally an image of my lasagna. And then you'd be like, hey, I want to go to that restaurant. So they're conveying a lot of knowledge through their sonar to each other about the environment. And then they can stun fish with the sonar. And then also they have what's called a click train, a whistle. So they each have a name and they know each other's names and can tell each other their names.
Wow, that's super interesting. Sounds like
Yeah.
a lot of research is being done on these bottlenose dolphins.
Oh,
And
more and more every day. Yeah.
yeah, which is great. And with that, I'm wondering what are some simple ways that people can support the species, either through funding research or through local initiatives or anything like that?
Well, they could donate money to the marine mammal stranding networks in their state. Like in Texas, we have the Texas Marine Mammal Stranding Network. So if a dolphin is injured, they respond. If a dolphin is dead, they take a necropsy, which gives us more information about what could be happening. Anything you can do to reduce sound in the water. Sound travels 7 times faster or 3 times faster in water than air. And so, like any way you can reduce sound in the ocean helps all marine mammals. Also, we have to remember every chemical that we apply to our yard, to our gardens, runs off the land during a rain event, enters the water, enters the food web. And so they're finding a lot of PCBs and other chemicals and plastics, microplastics in the dolphins, which means they're ingesting it as the food travels up the food web, it bioaccumulates in the fish that the dolphins are eating. So any reduction in pollution is paramount to the health of marine mammals. And air quality is also important because when they breathe, they are exchanging a lot more air than we do because they pull in all the air, they go underwater and they hold their breath for a long time. So I can't remember the exact amount of exchange, but like a bird exchanges almost 100% of its air every time it breathes. A bottlenose dolphin, I don't remember the percent, but it's a lot more than we do because we can just breathe at our leisure. We don't have to think about it.
Thank you so much for sharing those tips and information about the bottlenose dolphin. I think a lot of the ways we can help are very easy and practical, but not everyone knows about them. So it's super important that you came on here and talked to us. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and for everyone listening, thanks for tuning in and make sure to come back soon to learn more about these fascinating local species.
That's our show for this week. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Sarah Tabrez and Antara Varma. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.